Hello everybody, Raspberry Barrel here, and we're back for part 3 of Dipper, the Father of Stars by MewniHistorian. Hope you all are doing well, and are excited to get into this biography. Please forgive me if I stutter, hesitate, or mispronounce anything, and for any noises in the background. Let's begin. Cleo wasn't bedridden like with the last pregnancy, but had way more morning sickness than the last one. They received word around Torax of 903 BS that Avazandum was expecting a child, which brought joy to Dipper, hearing his cousin was going to be a dad. On Sagnog 10th, Cleo gave birth to their second child, a daughter, who they agreed would be named Orbita. She had her dad's blue hair, her grandparents' eyes, and had red planets on her cheeks. His two daughters got along just fine, and were fine on a ship as well. Dipper took them on a summer voyage to go visit Avazandum and his new family, and also to go see Cleo's family as they were finding ways to make the desert east of the Dragonfly Kingdom habitable. The easiest areas were the areas that were along the river that rang through the desert. When they made it home the month of Oag, Dipper received word his brother, King Leo, was expecting a child. His wife, Queen Sapphire, was showing when he saw her. The year to follow, 902 BS, Dipper became an uncle, and his daughters became cousins, and the Lazulis had their first prince, Stephen Lazuli, and most importantly, Leo was a father, which, trying to find balance between family and queen life, Dipper's voyaging days were, well, on hold. While he loved the sea, he loved his daughters more, but he frequently took to the beaches. Once his daughter Hemera found a clam with a beautiful pink pearl inside. After a couple of years of just Dipper and his girls, in the beginning of 898 BS, Cleo announced her pregnancy, and through the mirror they believed it was going to be a girl. After some discussion, the two came to agree on naming her Alexandra, after Dipper's deceased grandmother, and the first queen of their kingdom. Cleo went into labor after 11 days later, on Thurk 96, giving birth the next day on Grievance 15th, but not to a girl, but a boy. Their son was born with black hair and had his father's green eyes, and had dark purple flowers on his cheeks, resembling some flowers in the Dragonfly Kingdom. Rather than come up with a different name, they altered the name of Alexander, which was actually the name Alexandra herself was named after. While they weren't expecting a boy, Dipper and his family loved Alexander with all their hearts. Dipper, though, noticed how aggressive his daughters were. While they were sweet girls, when angered, they got extra violent. The only person who could escape this was Alexander. Some say the aggression Dipper seemed to have borne without was passed into his daughters. Dipper taught his daughters how to channel their aggression by putting them into warrior training. His son Alexander didn't show any interest in being a warrior. In the spring of 983 BS, Dipper's youngest brother Planet discovered a large series of islands north of the Orxenar Ocean, one of the few uncharted ocean areas left, till now. The islands were numerous and large, and close, almost like it was a single continent that broke apart into pieces, but the islands were all perfectly habitable, except for one or two very small islands. Dipper went to see it for himself the next year with his own family, and for the first time met Planet's son, Celino, mostly because they spent most of their time at sea. These islands were more than suitable for colonization, largely due to none of the islands having any monsters. Farfilian housed 7 kingdoms, Lebellion held 2, the Denial Kingdom having moved there after finding ways to live in the desert, and Luciolus only had the Firefly Kingdom. It was a tough choice, but during a tournament between the royals, the Robin Kingdom won the right to move their kingdom to the series of islands, naming it the Robin of Archipelago. In 891 BS, Dipper prepared to pass the wand to his daughter Hemera, after having it himself for over 37 years. In Cork that year, Dipper watched as the wand transformed from a large field into what appeared to be what today we call a magnifying glass, and he passed the spell book to her as well. While it felt weird to not have his wand, he was joyful when he saw his daughter practicing in the garden, laughing hard when she messed up with Celine's lightning dance and her hair stood on end. A family day out, 896 BS. In 890 BS, Dipper and his family traveled to the Firefly Kingdom with his family to attend the coronation of King Maroon. During so, Hemra asked Dipper about the lands past the Plegnog Mountains, knowing of a forest and sea, but not beyond that. Dipper explained that many ships did travel there from the coast, but none ever returned. Little did he know he gave his daughter an idea. A couple days later, Hemra stole a boat and traveled across what is now known as the Lapis Sea with her boyfriend Prince Jab Spiderbite. After a couple of weeks of searching by ship, Dipper found his daughter's boat and scolded her for her foolishness, but she was so happy she didn't care. She used the magic of the wand to help guide her way across the seas and found a new continent not far off the east coast of Luciolus. Dipper and the others traveled to see this new land, and sure enough, there was a new continent. About 2/3 of the coast had large jagged rocks and strong currents that no standard ship could have survived. But the middle area of the coastline, the one Hemra discovered, was a perfect area for ship docking. But when people went to explore, they encountered new monsters, making many Mewmans cautious about exploring this new land. While Lebellion did have monsters when discovered, they ran on sight, but the ones in the new lands were bolder. In the new land, there were 2 large forests at the north and south edges of the eastern coastlines. When his daughter was 16, she asked him if she could lead an expedition into the new continent. After talking it over more with Cleo, they decided when Hemra was 17, she could go out and explore. In 888 BS, Dipper said goodbye to his daughter as she and an expedition party set off from New Moon Harbor to explore the new lands, along with Jab Spiderbite. This left Dipper with his daughter Orbita and son Alexander, the first going through puberty while mingling with the commoner folk of the capital city that fall. While he was concerned about his daughter, he received word she was doing extremely well, which put him at ease. In 887 BS, Dipper's grandfather Zim passed away. At almost 127, he was the last of his siblings to go, ending the first generation of born royals. Using a preservation spell, he transported him to the new Dragonfly Castle in Lebellion, burying him in their crypt. Dipper also sent word for his daughter to meet him there, and he did, and she had changed quite a bit, and he saw so much. Writing in her journal, she showed her father and siblings. Instead of returning home, Hemra insisted she explore the uncharted bamboo forest north of the capital areas of the Dragonfly Kingdoms, and the swamp in the center of the continent. Dipper agreed, but expected to see her home in about a year. Dipper took a detour to re-explore the Duclean Oceans with his younger children. His son Alexander was particularly excited and showed an interest in sailing. When they returned home in early 886 BS, Dipper began to teach his son about being a captain. The same year, Dipper's daughter Orbita began having a relationship with Eric Johnson, crown prince of the Johansson throne. Later that year, his daughter returned home with even more information. People called her the Bright Knight because of how much knowledge she illuminated about those places, which Dipper found fitting. His daughter was shaping into a fine young woman, an excellent one, but she didn't know much about ruling a kingdom or advanced magic. In 885 BS, Hemra attended the Alaron Academy of Magical Arts. A counterpart opened up in both Lebellion and Luciolus, now known as East Luciolus, and the lands Hemra discovered were named West Luciolus. While there, Hemra also studied up on ruling, preparing for her future crown, a day that Dipper was both eager and scared for. Dipper both mad and proud of Hemra. After Hemra returned from her studies in Alaron, by the time it was under the governing of the monarch family in 883 BS, and she felt ready to take on the throne. So in the spring of the next year, 882 BS, Hemra was crowned Queen of Mewni, ending Dipper's 36 years of queen, for now. Later that year, Hemra chose Jab Spiderbite as her husband and married him the next year. Dipper's other daughter was independent by 881 BS and was admitted to Alaron Academy, but his son was still a teenager and convinced Dipper to take a trip around the world with him by ship after Hemra's wedding in the summer. Cleo went as well, the family sailing for several months with no destination, just relaxing and enjoying the ocean breeze. Dipper also taught his son a lot about being a captain, with Alexander actually being the captain of the ship. The year relaxation trip eventually turned to a much longer discovering voyage. Dipper, Cleo, and their son sailed around the Robin Archipelago, helping fill fill in the gaps between the many islands and later the seas around West Luciolus. As a family, they basically filled the remaining gaps in the world maps. Their daughters weren't jealous they missed out, as they weren't that interested in sailing. Mid-879 BS, Alexander's wings began to sprout, but rather than train in Aleron or one of the other academies, Dipper and Cleo taught their son out on the oceans how to draw out and control his magic. Even though Alexander was a butterfly, powerful magic takes training. Even when a princess gets the wand, they should start off with simple spells like Levitato before using a major spell like Warnicorn Stampede. But Dipper's son, though, seemed to be a born powerhouse. A simple exercise was him creating small waves in the water to get a handle on how much power to put into magic. But on his first try, he created a large tidal wave that moved the ship from port. It took a while, but Dipper and Cleo were able to help Alexander get a handle on how much power he put behind his magic. While his daughter, Hemra, carried on the crown, his sons seemed to have inherited their magic legacy. By the spring of 877 BS, Dipper and his family finally returned home after spending almost 4 years out at sea. So much had happened in Mewni in his absence, one of which was his nephew Stephen ascending to the Lazuli throne, and Hemra was helping him with moving his kingdom to the coast between East and West Luciolus, though much of West Luciolus was still being charted for the right areas of settlements. While he was gone, Dipper's other daughter, Orbita, married Eric Johnson, becoming Queen Johansen as well. Tired out from voyaging, Dipper spent time at home, looking over the kingdom while Hemra went out to fill in the blank spaces in the deep Gaian jungle. Dipper, during his time, helped set up a port in the lower end of the continent and southern-east corner to make travel to Luciolus continents faster. And Dipper himself would also help with the Lazuli transition to the two coasts, the only bio-coastal kingdom, and him and his brothers got together and helped teach the Lazuli citizens about sailing the seas and the river travel they were used to were two different skill sets. Dipper also taught magic as a guest at the academy in Aleron in his spare time as well. Dipper's son Alexander in 974 BS married a peasant woman named Zelina, a mage who Alexander met while traveling to the new Lazuli kingdom, where she was born into. Dipper was glad all 3 of his kids were married, and that meant he would someday have grandchildren, and Dipper didn't have to wait too long for that, because 2 years later in 872 BS, Hemra announced her pregnancy, and the family and kingdom was overjoyed that a new prince or princess was on the way. Dipper teaching Alexander magic. In the spring of 871 BS, Dipper and Cleo met their granddaughter Nebula, who looked like a mixture of her grandparents and had double-sided crescent moons on her cheeks. Dipper was the first outside of Hemra and Jab to hold her, and he cried when he did. Dipper and Cleo stayed at the castle to be close to her, and would look over her when Hemra and Jab would go out exploring and mapping the uncharted lands. The next year in 870 BS, on Zamaron 12th, both Dipper's mother and father passed away, devastating Dipper's family. The kingdom mourned the loss of their beloved former queen, Dipper burying her in Azulon in the crypts next to his grandparents, aunt, and great-grandmother. The next year, Orbita gave birth to a little girl, Hilda, but with the patriarchal nature of the Johansen kingdom, if she had a son, he would inherit over her. Alexander also stayed in the castle with his wife. Zelina and the two had a daughter themselves, Selene, born the year before when Selene and Azulon passed, named after the first. Years later, Hemra sent word she discovered she was pregnant while overseas in West Luciolus, helping finalize the new Phoenix Kingdom, and a massive hurricane prevented her from returning. Months later, it was safe for Cleo and Dipper's daughter to return home. While taking care of their grandchildren, there was suddenly a massive flash in the gardens. The day was Thurk 85th, 863 BS, and the two found a basket with a newborn baby inside. The child had silver crescent marks on her cheeks, meaning she was Hemra's daughter, and inside the basket was the magic wand. Filled with worry, Dipper used the magic to send a message to the developing colonies into the Lazuli kingdom, only getting a response from the latter. It informed him someone calling himself the Shadow Emperor drove out the Phoenix Kingdom inhabitants, and the Queen Hemra and the King Jab died getting the citizens to the coast to get to the Lazuli kingdoms. The news heartbroke Dipper and Cleo. Their daughter was dead, and worse, their granddaughters were now orphans, had no parents, their newborn granddaughter didn't even have a name. That night bells rang through the night for the loss of their queen, and poor Hemera was in tears. That day she was happily playing with her cousin Celine, without a care in the world, and that last night she was a princess. While his granddaughter was the queen now, nobody expected an 8-year-old to run things. Thus, Dipper was named regent till Nebula was ready to take the throne. Dipper's first order of business was to gather intel on what happened, and the Shadow Man used the same magic as the Mother of Dark Magic used, a dangerous dark magic, and named himself Emperor of the West Luciolus, and demanded the kingdoms stay away. Of course, Dipper and the other kingdoms declared war on the Shadow Emperor, and the Phoenix Kingdom also took a blow, as its king would have died if not for the flame he bared, and so the Phoenix princes stayed under the protection of the Butterfly Castle. The youngest Red Phoenix brought Nebula out of her weeks of sadness, something no one else was able to do. By Torix of 862, Dipper gathered the armies of the Butterfly and Johansson kingdoms. Orbita was its queen and personally traveled with the armies to East Luciolus along with Alexander to meet up with the Firefly forces. Dipper unfortunately had to stay behind because of his age, and he was needed to run the kingdom, but they swore to their father and mother that they would avenge their sister. Dipper never seeing the amount of bloodlust from anyone than those two when they declared that. Dipper was never one for violence, but this Shadow Emperor deserved death for what he'd done. With parents off to war, Dipper took part in raising Celine along with Nebula and the baby sister. Nebula named her Luna, literally moon. The Phoenix family stayed at the castle and was close with the butterflies, and the oldest son, Storm, was 15 and swore that he would fight when he turned 16 that year, and that he did. Dipper, Cleo, and their newborn grandchild, 863 BS. And that's where we're going to end part 3 of the biography of Dipper, the Father of Stars, by MewniHistorian on DeviantArt. Thank you all for listening, and please go check out MewniHistorian on his DeviantArt page. And thank you, MewniHistorian, for allowing us to read this. See you all next time for the final part 4 of Dipper's biography. Bye guys, have a great rest of your day!